Hello, and wherever you are, and whatever you're doing, welcome to the show, which is episode 37, Arsenic Aria. So, after a whirlwind hiatus in which we were dazzled by the delights of the big screen, critically appraised the political leanings of zombified cults, and asked whether that monkey in Outbreak did earn an appropriate commission, we find ourselves back on the historical plod. And what an episode I have lined up for you today. We continue to review the time period that spans the Middle Ages and Renaissance eras. Specifically, we are going to look at the intrigues and dastardly deeds of the political classes in Europe between the 13th and 18th century, as well as the effects of the wider availability of poisons on society. We are going to look at the wide and varied accusations of poisoning to be found within the histories of this period, as well as the types of poisons employed. As ever, my work here is reliant on a number of truly excellent academic works, and you can find them referenced in the show notes. I hope you enjoy the show today. The period we are dealing with today centres on the major European centres of commerce, as well as intellectual and societal transformations which emerge around the end of the 12th century. This includes cities such as Salerno, Montpellier and Paris. Such places were both forward and backward looking, inasmuch as they became melting pots in which classical ideas were rediscovered, Arabic works were translated, and new social and political orders were emerging. In major European trading cities, you'd be able to get hold of exotic spices, a range of genuine and not quite so genuine curiosities from foreign lands, and, as it turns out, to be important for our quest, an increasing range of toxic materials, such as mercury, arsenic and antimony, as well as a wide range of potentially lethal medicinal botanicals. In this period, the cutthroat nature of politics, coupled with increasing interest and availability of poisons, led to quite predictable consequences, in terms of both actual and imagined plots and murders. The emergence of laws and other controls on poison in this era are also testament to the extent of both elite and broader societal interest in this era. Naturally, such concerns led to responses from those in power, which included a clumsy and seemingly entirely unworkable ban on the sale of anything toxic or poisonous in Naples by Frederick II in 1231, as well as more specific decrees related to who could buy or sell poisons. The list of controlled substances, which often had both ascribed medical and more clandestine applications, would of course become increasingly specific and diverse in later centuries. In 1410, for example, in Venice, the sale of 8 substances was prohibited in all but 2 respected pharmacies. These were napellum, I assume aconite, opium, worms of Cather, I have literally no idea, answer on a postcard please, the arsenic curidum, perhaps an early example of regional protected status, curidum is in northwest Italy, arsenic sublimate, likely white arsenic or arsenic oxide. It was understood in this era that you could extract highly toxic arsenic compounds from ores via roasting them, which had a range of uses, particularly as insecticides. Silver sublimate, again, answers on a postcard, but I suspect this relates to mercury chloride. And methods to sublime mercury into mercury chloride by heating with salt are well described in alchemist texts from this era. Red arsenic, which is a reasonably commonly naturally occurring arsenic ore, which contains sulfur, which also had a number of benign uses, including removing hair from animal hides and traditional medicine, and was also used as a paint pigment. In addition, across Europe, and indeed beyond, there was also at least discussion of the need to distinguish poisoning as a particularly heinous form of murder in law, something we will be coming back to in later episodes. Now, there is certainly no shortage of intrigues involving accusations of poisoning within the great courts of Europe in this era, with medieval Italian city-states achieving a particular infamy. However, it is clear that as there were no reliable tests for poisoning in this era, and rather dubious, to put it lightly, approaches to proving the guilt of those involved, it is likely that many of the accusations discussed were fabricated at the time or embellished in the centuries which followed. However, what is clear is that the spectre of poisoning was something which played on the minds of many of the great families of Europe, and in particular in the chaotic and cutthroat world of Renaissance Italy, with the Medici and Borgia families being of particular infamy in this regard. The Medici family came to prominence as the rulers of Florence between the middle of the 15th century and the 1730s. And from this dynasty comes some particularly colourful accusations, including a foiled plot to assassinate Pope Leo X via a rather clandestine route, specifically the poisoning of bandages to be applied to abscesses on the pontiff's posterior. Others became more notorious for employing poisoners to do their dirty work, with Catherine Renée perhaps being the most notable. She was implicated in a number of suspicious deaths in the 16th century. The Borgia, of course, remained of equal notoriety. As a family, they were implicated in many assassinations, with poison allegedly being one of their preferred methods, at least according to hearsay. Where the grains of truth actually sit in these histories is of course unclear. However, it is worth noting that even today, new forms of evidence are emerging. In 2018, for example, researchers examined the bodies of two famous Italian philosophers who had died suddenly in Florence of an unknown cause, after succumbing to what were reportedly similar symptoms only 2 months apart. Through pathological examination of the remains, researchers managed to discount the hypothesis that one of the individuals had died of syphilis, and through the use of heavy metal analysis, they managed to demonstrate that arsenic exposure may have played a role in the demise of one of these individuals. Although the levels of arsenic found in bones, soft tissue and other materials associated with the bodies suggest that this exposure may have been chronic as a result of environmental exposure or medical treatment rather than stemming from acute poisoning. And these stories are colourful, if morbid. There is little doubt about this, but I think that this era is of deeper interest to us on our journey than merely curiosity, because it's a period of important transition in the history of our understanding of poisons, and it was also a period in which poison really comes into its own as a tool of statecraft as well as murder. During the Renaissance era, the interest and treatment of poisons was not only the reserve of medical practitioners, alchemists and, to be frank, chancellors, but also something in which even elites would exhibit an interest. It is probably fair to say that interest in poisons among the elites of Italy may have even been something of a trend, in the same way that later generations of aristocracy in Europe would be drawn to curiosities, charitable and pious quests, and esoteric study and collections. And indeed, the wide availability of mineral poisons and attention to poisons in the literature of the time, as well as well-publicised political scandals, led to broader public interest in them. During the 17th century, there would also be growing attention to the use of poisons in more domestic forms of murder, and the story of a concoction known as aqua tofana is particularly illustrative in this regard. In 17th century Italy, claims of poisoning, particularly against women, appear to have been common, and are a precursor to later moral panics about arsenic in Europe in the 19th century, which were driven by the wide availability of poisons as well as increasingly well-publicised cases. In around 1632, 2 trials took place in Palermo, Sicily, of women accused of making, using and selling a poison. It was claimed that the 2 women had worked together with a small circle of accomplices to create and sell a poison which likely contained arsenic, antimony and lead, and perhaps mercury. The group, who acted as local wise women and medical practitioners, would supply the poison upon request, usually to women who were unhappy in their marriages. The ringleaders would eventually be tried and executed, but in addition to that, the broader group of accomplices would also be captured and tried in the decades which followed. Unsurprisingly then, interest in poison as an aspect of crime and medicine led to many attempts to categorise poisons. This is reflected, for example, in the work of the so-called father of toxicology, Paracelsus, a German polymath and general Renaissance man who lived between 1493 and 1541. In one of his major works from the 1520s, he developed a theory of medicine which linked disease to the effects of the stars, poison, nature, spirit, and God. It's a really interesting theory, actually, if you get a chance to take a look. Obviously, completely wrong, but certainly sophisticated. His broader theory is, of course, a long time dead. However, he developed some insights into poisons which reveal much about how they were understood and used in this period. He argued that all disease-causing poisons originate from 5 metals and minerals, all of which we recognise as toxic today, including arsenic, mercury, realga, sulphur and related salts. He believed that all of these agents produced invisible vapours, especially when in liquid form, which pollute the air and weaken living organisms, through interaction with the influence of the stars. In support of his view, he argued that his complex underlying causal process explained why different humans and animals were affected by the same poisonous compounds in different ways. Further cementing this idea was the view he held that the effects of poisons emanated not so much from the poisons themselves, but the way in which the poisons interacted with specific organisms. Paracelsus also paid significant attention to the idea that poisons could build up in the body over time, leading to some rather interesting hypotheses about the effects of different foods on the digestive system, which would not feel out of place on my social media timeline. Such work was reflective of its time, in as much as it appears to be an amalgam of earlier Galenic theories of disease, Christian piety, as well as empirical observations about common mineral poisons, which were increasingly traded and employed in this period, and which also affected those that were mining them. Indeed, George Bauer from Saxony should perhaps hold the moniker as the father of occupational toxicology by virtue of his work with miners poisoned by the mineral cadmium. He advised these miners in the 16th century to make for themselves not only boots of rawhide, but gloves long enough to reach the elbows, and they should fasten loose veils over their faces. The dust will neither be drawn through these into the windpipes and the lungs, nor will it fly into their eyes. Coupled with this more practical guidance, one can also find more exotic protections and treatments within the literatures from this period, with rarity and cost seemingly adding to the curative powers. Animal horns in particular appear to have been sought after, from unicorns, authentic ones were particularly difficult to come by even then, as well as walrus, narwhals, as well as the horns from extinct creatures such as the woolly mammoth, with real specimens we assume being almost as rare as that of unicorns. Comparable schemes of understanding and treatment, as well as folk remedies, some effective and some much less so, would not only emerge in Renaissance Europe, but also in India and the Islamic world. As we briefly touched upon in an earlier episode, quests for universal poison antidotes can be traced back to the dawn of the Roman Empire and the story of Mithridates, the so-called Poison King, who had engaged in a lifelong quest to protect himself from poisons through work which extended to animals and even human trials. And, as the historian Alicia Rankin has argued, comparable experimentation stretches back further still into antiquity in both Western and Islamic medicine. In addition to more public demonstrations of the effectiveness of antidotes, some of which we assumed at least some sleight of hand, there were also what appeared to the modern mind to be precursors of some of the historic human experimentation which would occur in the name of both scientific progress and perverse ideologies in the 20th century. If you go to Langenberg Castle today, which can be found in Baden-Württemberg in southwest Germany, there is a rather innocuous-looking wooden trapdoor. This leads to an underground cavern, today full of roosting bats, which used to be used as the castle's prison. While the town of Langenberg is famous for being particularly zealous in the practice of witch trials, which occurred in the 17th century, it is not the victims of these hellish inquisitions which ended up here. Instead, our interest centres upon the occupant of the castle a century before, a German prince named Count Wolfgang II. Wolfgang's mother apparently had an interest in poison preventatives, and had recently acquired a sample of one of the touted cures of both plague and poisoning, which had been finding its way around German courts and was known as Terra Sigillata Silesia. This was reputedly a medicinal clay. The region of Silesia from which the clay came, and after which it is named, sits primarily on the western border of what is today Poland. The reputation of this clay had been strengthened by reports of successful trials of animals. Eager to evaluate the properties, the Count proposed the use of a recently condemned prisoner as part of a human trial. The test subject, or perhaps more accurately the victim, was promised that his death sentence would be reduced to banishment if he survived. The man, Tumler, would quite predictably die of arsenic poisoning in 1581 as a result of the experiment. This, it must be noted, was just one of a number of comparable trials which were conducted across Europe in this era. In this period, then, there are several developments which are important to understanding the emergence of modern practices relevant to poison weapons. And in the episodes which follow, we are going to take some deeper dives not only into these issues, but also into broader ethical and legal questions which poisons were beginning to become embroiled in. And so that's it for this episode. I very much hope you have enjoyed it. and I will see you next time as we continue our antisocial history of biological and chemical weapons on the Poisons and Pestilence podcast.